Well, good morning, Noam. It's about 7 o'clock here in Boulder, 9 o'clock where you are in Lexington. And I was wondering, what is your morning routine like? Do you start off with reading the Boston Globe and the New York Times?
Yeah, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times if it shows up, whatever.
And is the morning a good time for you to work? Or are you interrupted with a lot of phone calls like this one?
Usually, quite a lot.
Well, speaking of the Boston Globe, your daily newspaper, it's just been acquired by the New York Times, and the Globe is one of the last of the major papers in this country not owned by a chain. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a natural continuation of a tendency that's been going on for a long time, which Ben Bagdikian, for example, has been documenting year after year. But it's a sort of a natural phenomenon. Capital tends to concentrate. I frankly doubt that it would make much difference in the nature of the newspaper, at least for a few years. Over time, it probably will.
I mean, there is this well-documented trend in the concentration of media ownership. Do you see any counter trends?
Sure. There's, what you're doing right now is a counter trend. It's just like everything that's going on in the world. There's a trend toward centralization of power in higher and higher levels, but there's also a counter trend towards regionalization, what's called devolution in Europe, creation of grassroots movements, construction of alternatives. The new electronic technology, in fact, has given opportunities for lots of spreading of alternatives. Cable television offers alternatives. So things are going in both directions. Naturally, the more institutionally, the major tendency is centralization. The tendency in the opposite direction, which is the only hopeful one, in my opinion, is much more diffuse and has nothing much in the way of organized institutional form, but it's certainly going on at every level.
There are also these computer networks, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah, they offer lots of possibilities. I mean, there are tens of thousands of people hooked, or maybe hundreds of thousands hooked into various networks on all kinds of topics, and lots of discussion goes on, and lots of information comes through. It's of varying quality, but a lot of it is alternatives to the mainstream. Of course, that's still pretty much of an elite privilege at this point.
Speaking of the media, I recently got a letter from a listener in Lafayette, Colorado, which is a few miles from Boulder, and he heard one of your talks that I produced called Manufacturing Consent. I know you've never heard of that title before. And it was the talk you gave at the Harvard Trade Union program in Cambridge in January, and I thought his comments, the listeners' comments, were really telling, and I'd like to just read you a few things. He said after hearing the program that it left him feeling as politically isolated as the PR industry would have us, and he asked, how do we get organized? And is everybody so tied down by monthly bills to care? So there's multiple questions and concerns there.
Well, how do we get organized? There's a simple answer. You go ahead and do it. I mean, people have gotten organized under much more onerous conditions than these. Suppose, for example, you're a peasant in El Salvador, and you're forming a Christian-based community, which tries to become a peasant cooperative. I mean, the conditions under which those things took place are so far beyond anything we can imagine that to talk about the problems we face seems a little superfluous. Sure, we have problems. People are weighed down with bills. They have personal problems, this and that. But most of us live under conditions of extraordinary privilege by comparative standards. And the problem of getting organized is a problem of will.
But isn't one of the functions of the media to marginalize
Sure.
people like this listener who called and to convince them that affairs must be left to the experts and you stay out of it?
Oh, of course. I mean, but notice that it's done differently in El Salvador. There they send in the death squads. Here what they do is try to hook you on sitcoms. And it's true that both are techniques of control, but they're rather different techniques.
Now, you're a scientist, and I'd like you to talk about these notions of objectivity and balance in the media and in scholarship. Who determines those kinds of things?
Well, there's a big difference between the sciences and humanistic or social science scholarship or the media. In the natural sciences, you're faced with the fact that nature is a very hard taskmaster. It doesn't let you get away with a lot of nonsense. So it's extreme in the sort of more, at least the more well-developed areas of the sciences. It's difficult for error to perpetuate. Now, theoretical error, of course, can perpetuate because it's hard to detect. But if a person does an experiment and misstates the results, let's say, that's likely to be exposed very, very quickly, since it'll be replicated and so on. And in fact, there's a fairly stern internal discipline, which by no means guarantees that you're going to find the truth or anything like that. But it imposes standards that are very hard to break away from. There are all sorts of effects there are external conditions that determine how science proceeds. So, funding effects and so on and so forth. But it's qualitatively different from other areas where the constraints imposed by the outside world are much weaker, much less is understood. The empirical refutation is much harder to come by. And it's just much easier to simply ignore things that you don't want to hear. So let's go back to your opening comment about the Times taking over the globe. The press, the Eastern press at least, I don't know, out there, has been just flowing with praise for this and saying that because of the Times' high journalistic standards and there's no concern that this will have any danger. Well, there are thousands of pages of documentation in print which demonstrate that the Times' journalistic standards are anything but high. In fact, they're grotesque. But that doesn't matter because it can simply be ignored. It has the wrong message, so therefore you ignore it. Well, that's the kind of thing that's very easy in journalism or any of the other ideological disciplines. You just ignore what you don't like. The other day I read a summary article in the Washington Post by a pretty good reporter who knows a lot better than what he's writing on Central America, the U.S., the lost decade in Central America. And it expresses all sorts of puzzlement about why Central America is worse off than it was in 1980. And despite the enormous American aid that went, and it asks whether this American aid was well spent, or was it well designed, or maybe it went in the wrong areas, or something like that. So we have to reflect and see what went wrong with our enormous effort to bring democracy and social development to Central America, which, to our surprise, made it even worse than before. Well, the author of that article, at least when he's not writing for the Post, knows the answer perfectly well. The U.S. led a devastating terrorist war throughout the region to try to prevent democracy and social development. And these billions of dollars of aid that he talks about were billions of dollars to destroy. And that's why the countries are worse off than they were. But the Post can't say that. No matter how overwhelming the evidence is, it's perfectly possible simply to disregard it and to go on with fantasies that are much more pleasing to powerful interests and to oneself. Well, in journalism, or in a good deal of what's called soft scholarship, meaning outside the hard sciences, that's quite easy to do. And the controls are very weak, and the chances of it's very easy simply to ignore or to deflect critical analysis. In the hard sciences, that just won't work. You do that, and you're just left behind. Somebody else discovers things, and you're out of business. So there's years ago, C.P. Snow talked about what he called the two cultures, and he was much criticized for that. But there's something to it. They are rather different in character. I mean, there's all kind of further blurring comments that have to be made, but roughly speaking, the difference is real. So to answer your question, within the more developed natural sciences, although nobody has any illusions about objectivity, there is a kind of peer pressure control which is reflecting the constraints that nature imposes upon you. In the other areas, what determines what is going to count as objectivity is very largely convenience power.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be something that's situational, as it were, and mutable, unlike the hard sciences.
And again, if you look at serious monographic work in diplomatic history, let's say, the situation is somewhat different. Although their choices and focus and concentration and framing are themselves often quite ideological and can hardly fail to be. More honest people will recognize that and make it clear. The less honest will make it appear that they're simply being objective.
And of course, one of the central myths of the media is that they are objective and balanced.
Yeah, sure, that's part of their propaganda function. I mean, it's obvious on the face of it that those words don't mean anything. But what do you mean balanced? I mean, what's the proper measure of balance? There's no answer to that question. If the media were honest, meaning we're not doing their job, they would start by making it very clear on the front page, the part where it says all the news is fit to print, or Washington Post, an independent newspaper, and all that stuff. It would say, look, here are the interests we represent, and this is the framework from which we look at things. This is our set of beliefs and commitments. That's what they would say. Very much as critics say. Like, for example, I don't try to hide my commitments, and the Washington Post and the New York Times shouldn't do it either. However, they must do it because this mask of balance and objectivity is a crucial part of the propaganda function. In fact, they actually go beyond that. They try to present themselves as adversarial to power, as subversive, digging away at powerful institutions and undermining them. And I should say the academic profession plays along with this game. So if you look at, I've reviewed a couple of these in print. If you look at academic conferences on the media, they typically tend to, here's one that I went through in detail. It was held at Georgetown University and was incidentally run by a kind of a dovish, rather liberal-leaning Quaker, I think he is. It's about media coverage of Central America and the Middle East, and the way it's framed, the way the conference is framed is this. First come a series of statements opening the discussion by people who say the media are overwhelmingly biased against the government. They lie. They try to undermine the U.S. government. They're practically communist agents. And after these bitter attacks on the media for their adversarial stance, then come another set of papers which say, look, it's pretty bad, we agree, but it's not quite as bad as you say, and it's our job to be subversive, and that's what you have to face up to in a democratic society, and so on and so forth. And then then the debate goes on, and it's sort of left between these bounds. Well, there's obviously a third position. The third position is, the media are biased. In fact, they are supportive of power interests, and they distort and often lie in order to maintain those interests. But that position can't be expressed. In fact, in the conference I'm talking about, 100% of the coverage on Central America was within the bounds that I described. And on the Middle East, where the media are just grotesque, it was only 96% within those ludicrous bounds. The reason was that they allowed one statement by a scholar, a Middle East scholar, as associated with the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, and Eric Hoogland, and he made an accurate statement, and that's the 4%, which nobody ever referred to again. Well, okay, that's the way the media like to present themselves naturally, and that's the way the academic profession likes to see them presented. That if you can present the media as being critical, antagonistic to power, or maybe even subversive, that makes an enormous contribution to the propaganda function. Then they're saying, look how critical of power we are. How could anybody go beyond us?
Again, with the Boston Globe, in an article about the acquisition in the Times a few days ago, it pointed out that the Globe was one of the first papers in the United States to lead the crusade against U.S. intervention in Vietnam. Now, you've been reading this paper throughout this long period. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's very accurate. They published the first editorial calling for withdrawal from Vietnam, and the editor at that time was a close personal friend, and I followed this quite closely. They did a big study to determine if it would be possible to publish this editorial and still get away with it, and they finally agreed to do it. And my recollection is that was in late 1969. That is about a year and a half after Wall Street had turned against the war. And I think it's probably true that was the first call for withdrawal of U.S. forces. Of course, it was not framed in terms of a call to withdraw the U.S. forces that had attacked Vietnam, but rather we should get out, it doesn't make sense, and so on and so forth. That tells you something about the U.S. media. What it tells you is a year and a half after the business community determined that the government should liquidate the effort because it was harmful to U.S. economic interests, about that time, the courageous press timidly began to say, well, maybe we ought to do what the business community announced a year and a half ago.
Do you see knowledge as a commodity?
As a commodity.
Is it something that's traded and purchased and sold? I mean, obviously it's sold. One sells oneself in the marketplace.
Yeah, I'd be a little cautious about the knowledge part. I mean, what passes for knowledge is sold. I mean, take, say, Henry Kissinger, typical example. He certainly sells himself in the marketplace, but whether that's knowledge or not, one should be very skeptical about. The reason is that most of it is extremely. What's sold in the marketplace tends to be pretty. It works. I mean, it's knowledge or understanding shaped or distorted to serve the interests of power. But or to go to the say back to the hard sciences, their knowledge is certainly sold. In fact, I mean, take American high-tech industry or the pharmaceutical industry. One of the ways in which the public subsidizes them, so that to enrich the corporate sector by extorting money from the public. One of the ways in which that's done is through university research labs, which do straight research, but then the benefits of it consistently go to, if there's something commercially viable that comes out, it's handed over to private corporations. And there are even cases where, I don't know of any university departments which contract out directly to industry, but there are things not too far from that.
Well, would you say information is a commodity?
Well, these are statements that people make. I'm always a little leery about them. When you say that information is a commodity, it can certainly be sold. For example...
it can be traded as well.
It can be sold, it can be traded in elementary ways, like you can, a newspaper joins Associated Press, they purchase, or you go to a bookstore and you buy a book. Okay, information is being sold. It's not a deep point, I don't think.
No. Well, what about ways of acquiring knowledge outside the conventional structures? I mean, those being the colleges and universities.
Well, first of all, even within the conventional structures, colleges, universities, New York Times, and so on, if you read carefully, you can learn a lot. All of these institutions have to they have an internal contradiction, all of them, and that internal contradiction is important. On the one hand, they wouldn't survive if they didn't support the fundamental interests of people who hold power, who hold power primarily in the economic system, who have wealth and power. You don't serve those interests, you don't survive very long. So there is a distorting and propaganda effect and tendency. That's one. On the other hand, they also have within them something that drives them towards integrity and honesty and accurate depiction of the world as far as one can do it. Partly that just comes out of personal integrity of people inside them, say, whether they're journalists or historians or whatever else. But partly it's because they won't even do their job for the powerful unless they give a tolerably accurate a picture of reality. So the business press, for example, often does quite good reporting and accurate reporting, and the rest of the press too in many cases. And the reason is that people in power just need to know the facts if they're going to make decisions in their own interests. Now, these two conflicting tendencies mean that you sort of weave your way between them, you pick up quite a lot. But to get back to your actual question, outside these institutions, there are all sorts of things that people can do. So let's go back to that article in the Washington Post I mentioned about Central America. Central American activists in, say, Boulder or plenty of other places, when they look at that article, would just collapse in laughter because they know the facts. And they didn't find out the facts from reading the Washington Post, except maybe by sort of, the way you find things out by reading Pravda. They found them out through other sources. The Central American Solidarity movements had access to extensive information and still do through direct contacts, through alternative media, through people going up and back. That is completely outside the framework of the mainstream media. So, for example, one thing that this article by Douglas Farrar states is, just to give an example, is talking about some of the achievements of U.S. policy. He says the United States did compel the Marxist Sandinistas to run a free election in 1990, their first election. Well, that's everyone in the Central American Solidarity movements and plenty of other people knows that that's complete baloney, and that there was a free election held in 1984, except it came out the wrong way, so therefore it was wiped out of history by the U.S. Everyone knows that. In fact, the author of this article certainly knows it as well. But for him to say it would be like, standing up, in the Vatican and saying Jesus Christ didn't exist or something. You just can't say certain things within a deeply totalitarian intellectual culture like our culture. Therefore, he has to say that, and maybe even believes it, although it's hard for me to imagine. And that's like 100%. Everybody has to say that. But people in the popular movements know perfectly well that it's not true and know why it's not true. Those are because they've found other ways to gain understanding of the world. In case you heard a big bang in the background, that was one of the thousands of piles of books in my study collapsing on the floor, as happens regularly.
I can see you surrounded by mountains and stacks of papers and books.
Yeah. Well, occasionally they decide that the laws of physics won't handle it, may fall on the floor, which is what just happened.
You commented to a friend that the amount of material that you lose is, quote, awesome, but the amount of material that you retain is awesome as well.
It doesn't feel that way to me. I feel mostly the loss. And as I see it disappearing, it's agonizing. I mean, I know if I don't write about something within a couple of years, it will be gone, lost in these piles. And the trouble is, all of us feel like this. You're so far out of the mainstream that if the few people who follow these issues closely and who do write, if they don't deal with something, it's out of history. I mean, for example, the Nicaraguan election is in history, at least for people who care, primarily because Edward Herman did some very good research on it. Doesn't matter the Washington Post. I mean, for them it's out of history, period, because those are the orders from on high. But for people who want to know, you can look, say, at Herman's work.
Something you've been saying over the years strikes me as somewhat contradictory, and I'm wondering if you could shed some light on this. For example, when you're talking about the connection between U.S. aid and human rights abuses, you say that connection is, quote, obvious. And at the same time, you say that there's no way to know about these things, and you have to literally be a fanatic, as you describe yourself, to find these things out. Well, doesn't that leave people intimidated and disempowered?
Well, if I put it that way, I'm being a little misleading. If you, as an individual, you have to be a fanatic to find it out. On the other hand, if you're part of a semi-organized movement, like, say, the Central America Solidarity movements, which, you're not a card-carrying member, but if you're associated with popular movements, you don't have to be a fanatic. You just have to have access to alternative sources of information. So, for example, again, take Edward Herman, my friend and colleague, who did an extensive study of the relation between U.S. aid and torture. And he found they're very highly correlated. And that's published, and people can find it. One of the best, we've published it in joint books of ours and elsewhere. He's also published in his own books in detail. One of the top the leading Latin American academic specialist on human rights, Lars Schoultz at North Carolina, he published an article about 1980 on U.S. aid and human rights, primarily torture, in Latin America. He found exactly the same thing. As he put it in his article, U.S. aid is highly correlated with the most egregious human rights violators in the hemisphere are the highest aid recipients consistently. He also showed that this correlation has nothing to do with need, and it includes military aid, and it incidentally runs through the Carter period and the Reagan period. It just shot through the roof. Well, you can find those things out. Again, I've reported them. Ed Herman's reported them. And if you're part of the, if you have access to, if an individual wanted to know this, an individual like that person who you mentioned earlier, who felt very isolated, if he wanted to figure this stuff out, he'd have to be kind of a fanatic. It would take immense research to even find that anybody ever talked about these topics, because naturally, you're not going to find them in the New York Times Index. What you'll find is, article after article about our profound commitment to human rights. On the other hand, if you are part of the popular movements, you have easy access to such material, and you don't have to be a fanatic at all. You just have to have your eyes open.
In the tremendous amount of mail that you receive, are these views of isolation reflected? What is the temper of the mail?
Overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
This film that Mark Achbar and Peter Wintonic did, that's been playing around the world, often on national television and so on. And so I've been getting, and around this country too, though a little less prominently. And so I get a lot of letters, of course. And I don't know, there must be hundreds of letters by now, maybe thousands, I don't know. And very commonly, the tone is very much like what the person you mentioned said. In fact, a standard letter. This also happens if when I occasionally appear on TV in the United States, say on the Bill Moyers or Posner Donahue or something like that. I get a lot of letters saying, I was really interested to hear what you had to say. I thought I was the only person in the world who had thoughts like this. Where can I learn more about it or something? Sometimes I kind of cringe. The letters say, how can I join your movement? Meaning I haven't at all gotten across what I was trying to. But
yeah. Now, you steadfastly refuse to see the film Manufacturing Consent. Why is that?
Partly because of that feeling that however much they might have tried, there's something inherent in the medium, and no matter how much you try, which personalizes and gives the false, indeed ridiculous impression that that leads to questions like that. How can I join your movement?
How much time do you spend responding to mail per week?
I hate to think about it. Probably 25 hours or so.
So it's actually increased since, I think, the last time I spoke to you.
Yeah, it goes up and up. I was away for a couple of weeks in Europe and the Middle East giving lectures, and when I came back, I think it took me over 2 weeks just to clear away the mail,
and
doing nothing else.
And these are individual responses.
Yeah.
I know people are absolutely amazed when they do hear from you. They just sort of are stunned at the graciousness of your replies.
Well, I mean, those letters are often extremely serious and very thoughtful. I should say that on one topic, finally, I had to write a form letter saying, I'm sorry, I can't respond.
What was that?
Take a guess.
JFK.
That's it.
Conspiracy theories.
It just got to the point where I couldn't respond anymore. Because within the bounds of a 24-hour day, I couldn't answer the letters. So I, much to my regret, had to say, sorry, I can't do it.
And does that interest in conspiracy theories tell you something about the political culture?
Oh, yeah. It tells you something about what's undermining the left. In fact, people who believe in conspiracies, there's one really sitting there waiting for them. Here's one for your favorite conspiracy theorist. I'm not, notice, in case anybody misunderstands, I don't believe this for one moment, but it's the kind of thing that goes around. You can just imagine the CIA deciding, look, how can we undermine and destroy all of these popular movements? Let's send them off on some crazy wild goose chase, which is going to involve them in extremely detailed analysis and micro-analysis and discussion of things that don't matter and so on and so forth. That'll shut them up. That's happening.
Yeah, it's curious that there are elements in what is called the left in this country that has embraced this so fervently.
Yeah. Well, in my opinion, that's a phenomenon similar to this feeling of impotence and isolation that you mentioned. If you really feel, look, it's too hard to deal with the real problems, there are a lot of ways to avoid doing so. One of them is to go off on wild goose chases that don't matter. Another is to get involved in academic cults that are very divorced from any reality and that provide a defense against dealing with the world as it actually is. There's plenty of that going on too, including the left. I just saw some very depressing examples of it in my trip to Egypt a couple of weeks ago.
Could you be more specific?
Yeah, I was there to talk on international affairs, and there's a very lively, civilized, intellectual community, very courageous people who spent years in Nasser's jails being practically tortured to death and came out struggling and so on and so forth. Now, throughout the third world, there's a sense of great despair and hopelessness, and the way it showed up there in educated circles, and very educated circles with all kind of European connections, is to become immersed in the latest lunacies of Paris culture, and to focus totally on those. So, for example, when I would talk to even places like Strategic Institute, they're concerned with they got to be concerned with the realities of the world.
This is in Cairo?
Yeah, in Cairo. I was talking to, Egyptian intellectuals and so on very commonly. This is also true in the articles that appeared about my talks. They could not really, as long as I was talking about, well, the way you've heard more than enough of my talks, so you know what they're like. No fancy theory, don't believe in it, down to earth, and so on. They couldn't understand it unless it was first translated into some sort of postmodern gibberish. And then, and so, for example, rather than have me talk, say, about the details of what's going on in, say, U.S. policy or the Middle East, for that matter, where they live, which is too grubby and uninteresting, they would like to know, say, how does modern linguistics provide a new paradigm for discourse about international affairs that will supplant the post-structuralist, some text or something or other. Would really fascinate them, but not say what do Israeli cabinet records show about actual internal planning. That's really grubby.
This was your first visit to Egypt, I take it.
Yeah, but incidentally, that's when that happens in Egypt, it's very sad. When it happens all over the West, as it does, it's maybe comical or unpleasant, but not devastating.
Yeah, I just got back from Amsterdam, where I did some interviews and gave some talks, and precisely those kinds of convoluted, very pretentious questions were asked.
Yeah, I've seen the same. In fact, in Holland, these are ways in which intellectuals can separate themselves from actual ongoing struggle and still appear to be lefter than thou. Nobody's radical enough for us. But meanwhile, you advance your career, you separate yourself from things that are going on. You don't have to get involved in popular activities. You don't have to really learn about the world and so on, let alone do anything about it. I'm not, again, I'm overstating. I don't want to say this is true of everybody by any means, but there are elements of it. These are other ways of reacting to the fact that dealing with the problems of the world is hard and unpleasant. And if you do it, and especially if you begin to do it effectively, it won't, there are personal costs.
Well, it also creates a tremendous gap between them and so-called people.
Oh, sure. I mean, nobody can understand this stuff. And that has the effect of intimidating people, especially young people coming into the colleges who look at this and say, my God, if I have to be a radical, I'm going to have to understand all these 10-syllable words. It's hopeless. I better do something else.
What did you learn about the Islamic movement in Egypt?
Well, I don't want to overstate. I wasn't there long enough to learn a lot, but I should say that of all I did meet a pretty wide range of people, and people I knew and people who were recommended to me and so on. The only ones who I came, almost the only ones who I came across who were seriously thinking through problems of Egypt and the region were the intellectuals I met who were associated with the Islamic movements. Now, the ones I met were kind of on the secular wing of these movements, so I didn't meet the clerics and so on. But these are people who regard themselves and are regarded as oppositionists and part of the Islamic movement, and they plainly do have grassroots connections. And they themselves describe the movement as split between the more progressive sector, as they describe it, and what they call the rigid sector, meaning the real deep fundamentalists who say, look, we go back to Quranic law and Sharia, and that's the end of it. But they themselves were thinking about how to domestic and regional development and local problems in ways which are not at all unrealistic. Furthermore, these movements actually do things. So they do provide health care, and they run welfare programs, and they try to deal with people's problems and so on, and they're almost unique in that respect. Everyone agrees to that, even the people who hate them.
What do you think is driving? What's the motor that's pushing this movement in Egypt?
Well, I think the motor, that you just walk around Egypt and you can see the motor. There was a period of secular nationalism, and of which Nasser was the leading figure, and that failed or was destroyed, and partly by itself, partly from outside. The country, about around 1980, Sadat opened it to this, undertook a policy which translates as opening up, meaning, in effect, structural adjustment, neoliberal policies. And they had the usual effects, the effects they have all over the world. It's completely predictable by now. They increased very sharply the split in the society between great wealth and privilege and enormous misery and suffering, with the proportions being by no means balanced. The privilege is narrow. and those tendencies increase. So people are suffering, and they see right next to them enormous wealth and privilege. They see the government is totally corrupt, doesn't do anything. It's a police state, not a harsh police state, but you can't forget it for more than a few minutes walking around the streets. And under those conditions, also they see the country, the leadership kowtowing to the West and selling out. There's no lacking in any ideals or principles apart from the economic effects. What happens under those conditions? People turn to something else. It's happening all throughout the region.
Is it not really happening throughout the world, as there's a global impoverishment, and you see it in...
No, but these tendencies are going on throughout the world. I mean, the rich countries, the Western countries, are imposing these policies, these neoliberal policies, as they're called, on the third world. They got a lot of... they have plenty of power. I mean, the debt crisis, for example, is being used as a very effective weapon to try to force most of the third world into these programs, which are just legal. And the rich countries themselves don't accept those policies. They don't accept free market policies for themselves, of course. They're too destructive. However, there is as the economy becomes more global, more internationalized, there's an automatic effect of bringing back a kind of third world tendencies into the rich countries themselves. It's not very mysterious. If jobs are, if U.S.-based corporations can send productive labor, productive work to low-wage, often high-repression areas, say to Mexico or nowadays to Poland and so on, that means that productive labor is lost here. It means that American capitalists can be very rich, but American workers are going to have to compete with people in what are in effect third world countries like Poland or Mexico.
Yeah, apropos of that, there was a photo in the paper here a couple of weeks ago. The University of Colorado at Boulder graduating class, and one senior held up a sign: "We'll work for food."
Yeah, well, that's all of it. You see that right outside of rich shopping centers right near where I live. And so the effect is to bring back though the wealthy countries will never and never have accepted the neoliberal principles, the free market principles they impose on the poor, the consequences of imposing them on the poor are slowly to have this third world model seep back into the rich countries themselves. It's very striking in the United States. You can see it in Europe, particularly in England, and in the continent you're beginning to see it as well. And it's very conscious. There's nothing secret about it. I mean, the business press, quite openly, Business Week, Financial Times and so on, are very open in saying, look, European and American workers, especially European workers, are going to have to give up these luxurious social programs. They're going to have to stop being pampered. They're going to have to accept labor mobility, meaning lose your job, because corporations can go over to Eastern Europe, where, say in Poland, they can get trained workers at 10% the wage of the pampered West European workers, no benefits, and a highly repressive government which breaks up strikes and so on. So therefore, you guys better recognize what's in store for you. There was an article in the Financial Times, for example, with a wonderful headline. It was called "Green Shoots in Communism's Ruins," meaning, well, yeah, communism's a wreck, but there's some green shoots. There are a few good things. And the good thing was that as the capitalist reforms are imposed in Eastern Europe, pauperization and unemployment are following, which lowers wages and makes it possible for Western corporations to move in and make huge profits, of course, at the cost of the Western European populations. But those are the green shoots.
Yeah, there's of course been a huge increase in unemployment in the Western European countries, and that has an attendant social component. There've been many attacks against immigrant communities.
Right. Yeah, I mean, unemployment and a loss of hope leads to social breakdown. We're much more advanced in that respect. There's a kind of breakdown of social structure in American urban communities, which is amazing to most of the world. So, take say Cairo again. Cairo is a very poor city, extremely impoverished. There's nothing like it here, but nevertheless, there is a sense of community that exists that doesn't exist here. You feel safer walking through the streets there than here. You don't stumble over homeless people. People are taken care of somehow. It's the same in Nicaragua, say, or many other third world countries that haven't totally broken down. We are beginning to get third world characteristics, but under conditions of social breakdown, and that's very dangerous. That's why you can have people cheering when someone wins a court trial after having blasted away somebody who dared to step on his lawn with a shotgun.
The case in Louisiana.
Yeah. That appalled most of the world. They just couldn't understand it.
Right. Well, your latest book, as of this morning, Howard Zinn always tells that, he adds that little quip, as of this morning, is Letters from Lexington. Do you have any more books planned?
Yeah, I promised to write up lectures on international affairs in the Middle East that I gave in Cairo. That'll come out as a book, short book, American University Press in Cairo.
Is the summer a good time for you to work when you're away from the interviews and the phone calls and the classes, etc.?
Yeah, well, as you know, I turn off the phone. That's about the only time I can try to get anything done. Right.
Well, later this year, you're going to actually turn 65, believe it or not. Any thoughts about...
Don't believe that propaganda, do you?
It is, well, it's been reported in certain journals. Have you thought about slowing down or cutting back on your schedule at all?
Yeah. There are an awful lot of things I'd like to do that I'm just not getting to. And, there isn't all that much time.
That joke that Mike Albert tells when he went to Poland some years ago. He found people that thought that there were two Noam Chomskys, one who did the linguistics work and the other who did the political work.
Well, partly the name doesn't sound as strange to them there.
Actually, there was this serious reactor explosion in the town in Tomsk in central Russia. Is that at all connected to your name?
It could be. Nobody really knows the etymology, but Roman Yakovson, this great Slavic linguist and scholar, he always told me he was convinced that was the origin. It was a corruption of Tomsk, which is the same as Thomas, basically.
And is Avram your actual given name, or is it?
It is, but my parents never used it, so I use my middle name,
right,
which has almost become my legal first name by now, I guess.
Just to backtrack a little bit, we were talking about...
Incidentally, just to show you the good old days of real sexism, I once had to get a copy of my birth certificate, and I discovered that a clerk hadn't believed my name and crossed it off and wrote in pencil above it, Avrane, A-V-R-A-N-E, Naomi. Well, why Avrane? Because girls are allowed to have crazy names, not boys.
Just to back up a little bit, we were talking about Egypt. You also went to Northern Ireland.
Right.
What did you find there in terms of economic conditions and the political situation?
Well, I spent I spent most of my time either in West Belfast, which is a mainly Catholic and very repressed area, or southern parts of Northern Ireland within what are called bandit country, places where the British troops can only go in fairly substantial force and where there's been plenty of atrocity. And I talked to human rights activists, I was at the main Center for Human Rights to Gerry Adams, who's the head of Sinn Féin, and others, and to a lot of people just who I met. And it's the situation is, I mean, the country is, it's under military occupation. There's no secret about that. There's armored personnel carriers going through the streets and armed blockades right in the middle of Belfast Center and so on. And there's plenty of killing up and back by paramilitaries on both sides. There's open debate about the extent to which or if the British forces are connected to the loyalists, the mainly Protestant paramilitary. And there's probably certainly some connections, but nobody knows how much. And in the Catholic community, well, I must say, listening to the stories was very much like walking around the West Bank a couple of years ago. Same stories, same kinds of humiliation and beating and torture and so on. There aren't a lot of ways to have your boot on someone's neck. It always turns out about the same.
It just echoes the religious conflicts of the Middle Ages in Europe.
Well, the British, when they moved in there back in the mid-17th century, carried out real ethnic cleansing. The indigenous population in what's now Ulster was mostly just driven out, driven into off into Central Ireland.
And was there settler colonialism?
Oh yeah, I mean they brought in Scotch and other British settlers to replace them, and they took most of the fertile land. So, for example, traveling through South Armagh, one of the kind of like around the border, I spent some time with a local civil rights group that was set up after a couple of young men were murdered by British troops who are now coming up for trial years later. But you talked to the farmer, man, I guess maybe my age or a little older, whose son had been assassinated. He just took me around and showed me what things were like, and we spent some time together. And the ground is extremely, every place where they can grow any. I asked him, what do they do? He said, well, they raise cattle, but they can only raise young cattle because the earth is too unfertile to grow grass good enough to raise adult cattle on. So they raise the calves and so on and then send them off somewhere. And then he described how you do it. He said every acre is completely reclaimed. You first got to pull out all the rocks and move them somewhere else and try to level the ground and so on. And these are the areas to which the Irish were driven off into the rocky hills by the British, who cleansed the fertile areas and brought in their own settlers. This happens to be a couple of centuries ago, but the residue is still there.
Do you see any solution to the problem of Northern Ireland?
Well, the only solutions I heard, and I should say both in the Republic and in the North, that made any sense to me. There are a lot of people thinking about it naturally, and a lot of serious people, but the approaches that seem to me to make most sense, and these have been written about to an extent, are the hope that within the context of, as we were discussing before, there are counter tendencies going on in Europe. There's a tendency towards centralization in the European community executive, which is almost totally insulated from public pressure. And there's a counter tendency of regionalization. So local regions, whether it's Catalonia or the Basque Country or Wales or whatever, are beginning to become more involved in developing their own cultural authenticity and forms of independence and degrees of self-government and so on. And in the context of this regionalization and devolution, it's not impossible that the two British Isles could break down into a kind of federal arrangement, maybe as part of a broader European federalism, which would involve a degree of independence in a number of areas: Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland, the contemporary republic, and so on. And in that context, I think you might imagine a solution. I don't see much else. I mean, within a couple of years, the population of Northern Ireland is going to be about 50-50 Catholic Protestant, according to demographic projections.
Well, I have to tell you that going back to the level of mail that you get, some years ago I wrote you a letter, and that was my first contact with you, and you graciously responded, and that led to a correspondence, and then we started doing interviews, and it really helped to get alternative radio going. So I can bear witness and give testimony to the enormous efficacy of your efforts, and I think I speak for a lot of people who really appreciate what you're doing, and it does make a difference.
Well, it's reciprocal. I mean, I very much appreciate what thousands of people are doing everywhere, which is making a difference. That's made a big difference. These activities of many, many people around the country, indeed around the world, have made a tremendous difference over the last 30 years.
Yeah, it's incremental. It's people want to see dramatic changes, but the culture and the politics change rather slowly.
Yeah, they do, but they're different. It's very different from what it was. You wouldn't have to wait until 1969 under conditions like the 1960s. You wouldn't have to wait till the fall of 1969 for the first newspaper to timidly suggest maybe we ought to stop aggression.
Right. Well, thanks very much for all your efforts, and have a restful summer, and take care of your foot. How's it going?
Oh, it's okay. Just a fractured bone.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Noam.
Okay.